Hey everybody. I'm sorry about having to miss class today. I hate missing class, but just wasn't feeling right. Feel a little off today, but I do want to kind of try to keep us a little on track. So I'm going to talk a little bit about simple learning and also classical conditioning, and then at the end I'll have a short activity for you guys to do so that you're ready to start the next class discussing that activity. We'll do a quick recap of this information in the form of I'll ask you a few questions and make sure we're all on the same page before we start getting into operant conditioning. This chapter to me starts to get into a lot of the realistic stuff that you can really put psychology into action. Hopefully you'll see as we move through this information, hopefully it'll kind of dawn on you that, hey, I've done that before, and now we're just going to put some terms to it, or, oh my goodness, people have been doing this to me for years, and I didn't even realize this was a thing. So hopefully we can see some of those parallels as we move forward. Um, so the plan over the next week is to hit these key parts of learning. So simple learning and classical conditioning is what I'm going to focus on in this short lecture, and then we'll start getting into operant conditioning, which you'll find very useful and to me pretty intriguing. And then we'll wrap everything up with learning in a social environment, which also is a pretty interesting topic. So let's start in with simple learning. Now, one of the things about the simple forms of learning is we know, and we've talked about this, it's especially true in babies, but we too are sensitive to new things or novelty in the environment. And so, for instance, when we encounter something new, we tend to devote our attention to that new aspect of our environment. This is something called the orienting response. And so when we see something new, we tend to orient our senses to that and our attention. But one thing that's interesting about this is that after you've been exposed to that previously new thing multiple times, a couple of things can actually take place in terms of behavior change, right? So when we're talking about learning, we're talking about learning as a relatively permanent change as a function of some sort of experience in terms of our behavior. And so if you see something new, but over time you see it again and again and again, or experience it again and again and again, one of two things typically happen. And the first one actually gives us to our first term in terms of a simple form of learning, and that's habituation. And when we talk about being habituated to something, we are decreasing a behavioral response after being exposed to something repeatedly. Now, we may initially orient to that, focus some attentional resources to that new thing, but after we have been exposed to it over and over and over, we tend to not pay much attention to that. And to kind of give it a sense of why we might do that, if it's not something that's going to hurt us or harm us, or it's not really going to help us in any way, we can kind of learn to ignore it. So let's talk about a few examples, and these may not be the examples you were thinking of, but I do want to bring up one thing, and I know we've mentioned this in the classroom, but if you think about placing yourself in the classroom, right, and think about some of the things that are going on in that environment that maybe on the first day you noticed, but you've gradually learned to ignore. And you can't put this in here, you can't say that you've learned to ignore me. But other things that are happening in that large classroom that has weird acoustics, right? Maybe it is people clicking their pen over and over and over again, and it's not really hurting you, but it's not really helping you, so you learn to ignore it. The whir of the projector, maybe. So there are probably things that are in there, and now that I've pointed them out, may actually lead you to the next form of simple learning now that I've said that. I apologize in advance. Here are a couple of examples. You can actually see this in a rat when you have a rat in an operant chamber, which we'll talk about next time. But you can actually habituate the startle reflex. And so what you'll see here is a rat who will initially be startled by a loud noise, but then gradually after repeated exposure, you see that that startle response goes away. Let's hope this works. Looks like it's going to. Okay, move it back to the start here. So the initial. It's another trial. Now you see gradually we're not responding anymore. Now we're doing something else altogether. So hopefully you get the idea. With repeated exposure to something that's not really harmful nor rewarding, the rat kind of learned to ignore it, and you see that behavior in response to that decline. You can see this in slugs. You know, if you're ever bored, you can go out and touch a slug, and you do this repeatedly, and you see a change in their behavior. A lot of times is a good example of habituation. You know, if you're bored on a Friday or something. So if you've ever touched a slug, right, you can see here the little tentacles here at the front, or the antennae, or whatever they're called. Not a biologist. But if you touch it, they're going to shrink up and they're going to kind of suck themselves in. But gradually, if you touch them over and over and over, you see that that response tends to decline. So here you're going to see him touch with a Q-tip, and you'll see that initial response. Okay, they bring those tentacles in, and if we scroll a little further, oh, there was his hand. Let's try this. Okay, we're still sucking our tentacles in, and if we go down here, a little later, maybe not quite as much, but again, gradually over time, that response will decrease. Again, just another example. There are probably lots of these that you can think of on your own. Now, the flip side, habituation is one response to repeated exposure. The other form of simple learning is called sensitization. And now here, if we think about why we might have these kinds of processes, if you think we have limited resources. So if there are things in our environment that are neither harmful or helpful, and if we learn to ignore those, we can use those resources for other things. Now, it may not always be the case where something in the environment doesn't deserve our attention. So if it's something in the environment that could have an impact on us, then we might actually become sensitized. And so in this case, you might have something that you get sensitized to, and you increase your behavioral response after repeated exposure. And it could be something threatening, and I put annoying in here because I'll have an example from our house about this. And I'm sure that you guys have probably have similar situations. But one that might be potentially threatening would be a situation where I might smell smoke while I'm sitting in the house, right? And it's repeatedly, I can repeatedly smell it. That might be something that would be beneficial to me to not ignore, right? But actually devote more attention to that, or change my behavior toward focusing more on it. So that might be the threatening situation where it wouldn't really be a good thing to habituate. But there are also situations, this is why I put annoying in there. And I take our old dog, for instance, who is one of those yappy, small terriers, where I can put him in one of these rooms at the house, and he'll just bark, 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 bark. And it's one of those things that I get sensitized to. I hear it over and over and over, but I can't I have a real hard time not attending to it. So I actually become sensitized, and it gets harder and harder and harder to ignore that with repeated exposure. So in the end, we have two forms of simple learning: habituation, sensitization. In habituation, you learn to ignore if it's something that's not particularly uh, threatening or helpful, and you're repeatedly exposed to it, you can learn to ignore, so your behavioral response decreases. If you are sensitized, the other form of simple learning, your behavioral response increases as a function of repeated exposure. Now, if we move to the next kind of level of learning, you start to move into what you start to see as complex or a little more complex types of learning, because there are multiple pieces involved in this. And kind of, this is probably one of the hallmarks of every intro psych class, and that's classical conditioning. And this part of learning is really the study of um, simple associations, right? How do we learn to connect things in the world around us that we ourselves are not in control of? So that's really what classical conditioning is all about, and asking the question, how do these simple associations form? And this really started back when we had Ivan Pavlov, who we'll talk about on the next slide. But again, how do these simple associations form where we are able to learn how things are connected around us that we ourselves are not control? So learning the relations between events that occur that are out of our control, right? So we're not causing any of these events, but we learn that they are connected. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to prepare for future events, right? And so the classic example is that we have learned that lightning and thunder tend to go together, right? So if you hear thunder, you tend to see lightning, or vice versa, right? They tend to go together, but I'm fairly confident that none of us are actually in control of the lightning and the thunder, right? So we're learning the connection between these events that are out of our control. An example from our house is, I know that when the oven timer beeps that dinner is done, I can almost predict that Bennett is going to come running down the stairs, right? I am neither in control of the dinner bell, right, or what Bennett's behavior is, but I know that they tend to go together, right? I can predict that when that timer goes off, Bennett's coming running, right? So like I said, this all really started to gain some organization in terms of studying these simple associations with Pavlov. And he was a Russian physiologist, and what he did is he used dogs as his research studies. He was a physiologist, so he was actually interested in the process of digestion. And through his studies on digestion with dogs, particularly salivation as it relates to digestion, he discovered some interesting things, which actually became a very big cornerstone of the learning process in psychology. And so what he discovered as he was doing this, and we know this not only happens in dogs, but in his case he was studying dogs, but also humans, that we salivate when food enters the mouth. That's the initial part where food is broken down. And so Pavlov discovered this in his dogs, and some of his specific observations were as follows. He noticed that there were some stimuli that produced automatic responses naturally. Okay? It was almost reflexive, that if this particular stimulus is in the environment, it's going to elicit this particular response. And there's no need to learn those connections, right? It's natural, it happens, it occurs. The other thing that he found out through his work is that other stimuli that are not initially driving those responses or eliciting those responses can actually start to produce those responses or elicit the responses as well through a process of learning, and this is that classical conditioning process. So let's talk first about the terms related to classical conditioning before we try to put it all together. So first, the first term to talk about is the unconditioned stimulus. Now, when you see the word unconditioned, think this is something that's not learned. Okay? The unconditioned stimulus, or the US, is that stimulus that automatically, without any learning, will elicit a response prior to any sort of training. Right? So these are those stimuli that Pavlov referred to as those naturally occurring stimuli that will automatically, without any learning, elicit a particular response. Food is the good example here, right? So food naturally elicits this salivary response. Now, the unconditioned response, or the UR, is the response that is produced automatically prior to any training when that unconditioned stimulus, or US, is present. No training needs to be applied. If the unconditioned stimulus is present, it elicits the unconditioned response. So in this case, if we keep with Pavlov, food presentation naturally elicits salivation. Okay? It's not something we need to learn. It's a reflexive type of situation. So unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Now, this is a tricky one, okay? Something called the conditioned stimulus, the CS. These are those potentially other stimuli in the environment that don't automatically elicit a response, but through conditioning can elicit a response. Now, pay attention to this particular statement. The conditioned stimulus, or the CS, is an initially neutral stimulus that is paired with the unconditioned stimulus during classical conditioning. Now, let's start here. This part here about an initially neutral stimulus. It's neutral before the learning process begins, because it, before any learning occurs, does not elicit a response. Okay. But when we take that neutral stimulus and we pair it with an unconditioned stimulus, and remember, the unconditioned stimulus, when presented, automatically leads to an unconditioned response. Okay. If we present that initially neutral stimulus, right, before the unconditioned stimulus, and we do that repeatedly, that initially neutral stimulus will actually become associated, right, with the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response, so that once we've done that enough, this initially neutral stimulus becomes conditioned, and when we present the conditioned stimulus, we can do it without the unconditioned stimulus present, we'll get the response, right? So in terms of, let's keep with Bennett here, right? So the Bennett example, right? We know that let's say this is from Bennett's perspective, right? So Bennett has that situation where presentation of food leads to salivation, okay? And now, if over and over and over he hears the oven timer go off, right? Then there's presentation of food and he salivates. If he hears the timer, presentation of food, salivate, timer, presentation of food, salivate, over and over and over again, what originally did not automatically elicit the salivation, the oven timer, now when the oven timer beeps, Bennett may start salivating. Right? And he does that potentially without any presentation of food. So the response that is elicited by the conditioned stimulus is now the conditioned response. That's the learned response produced by the conditioned stimulus. That stimulus that we have learned is connected to this response. Right? So we salivate, or Bennett salivates, in response to hearing the beep and not the presentation of food. So here's a good kind of thing to break down, and we'll break this down with Pavlov's example of how this occurred. And I'm going to break it down into different parts. So there's going to be a before conditioning, a during conditioning, and an after conditioning, so you can see where these terms fit. And one recommendation I'll have is that as you think through these situations, it's best to draw them out in this before, during, and after conditioning example each time so that you can see the process. And I think that's really good, seeing the process and where the particular terms fit. So remember, Pavlov was working with dogs and salivation, and I've broken this down before conditioning. Right? These are things to show you what the terms are and how they relate to this whole situation before any sort of conditioning happens. So we know before conditioning that food, the unconditioned stimulus, automatically elicits salivation, which is the unconditioned response. Also before conditioning, we know that if we were to ring a bell, and just ring a bell, right, it would not automatically elicit salivation. Okay. Now, at this point in this diagram, even before conditioning, it's listed as the conditioned stimulus. I want you to remember that at this point, before any conditioning has occurred, this bell is a neutral stimulus. Okay. So before conditioning, we have an unconditioned stimulus that automatically elicits an unconditioned response. Okay, these are naturally connected events. And we have a bell that is neutral, right? In other words, it's neutral because it doesn't elicit salivation before conditioning. Now, during conditioning, we're going to ring that bell, right? This is the part where that neutral stimulus is going to become the conditioned stimulus. So we're going to ring the bell. We're going to present the food, that's the unconditioned stimulus, and we know that the presentation of this automatically elicits the unconditioned response of salivation. And during conditioning, we're going to do this repeatedly. Ring the bell, present the food, get the salivation. Ring the bell, get the food, get the salivation. Now, it's important to note, and we'll come back to this because I'm going to talk about it from a neural perspective at the end of our lectures on learning, but this unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response are very well connected, right? They're very well correlated, right? By adding the bell ahead of the presentation of the food, you're adding this bell into this strong connectivity, right? Things that are correlated together in time, right, tend to get correlated together neurally, right? So we strengthen those connections through the conditioning process. And so bell, the now conditioned stimulus, if we present the bell without the unconditioned stimulus, we can actually elicit salivation, and that is now the conditioned response, right? Because it's being elicited by the bell, which is the conditioned stimulus. So again, when you go through these examples that we're going to have, and I'll give you one to practice at the end of this lecture, draw it out just like this so you can walk yourself through the procedures and link these terms together in this format. Okay. Now here are a couple of examples. One, you can find a lot of stuff on YouTube, but here's an entertaining course project that I thought you might like, and you can kind of think about this.
This is the family who wanted to connect. and find inspiration in new places.
Hey Psych 101 class, I'm David and I'm going to be testing Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning on my roommate Brian. The conditioned stimulus will be this sound effect.
That was easy.
And then I'm going to shoot him with this airsoft gun. He will soon learn the relationship between the sound effect and the shot before he gets too hurt.
Just so we're all clear, his roommate's going to learn the relationship between those things through repeated pairings, right? But he's not in control of any of that.
That was easy. That was easy. That was easy. That was easy.
All right, so this looks like, I think this is going to be the test trial.
That was easy.
All right, guys, looks like Pavlov's theory worked.
So he had connected the that was easy, which was initially neutral, right? Because he didn't flinch at the sound of that before being shot with the airsoft gun. When you pair those two things together, that was easy allows for prediction that, hey, I'm probably going to get hit and flinch. So I don't know, fun way to think about it. I think a good way to practice this is recapping Pavlov experiment using the terms, and we'll start with this when we meet next time. But a practice that I want you to practice through is one that will hopefully allow you to not forget, because it's so weird. I found this in an article a long time ago in the 90s that it has stood out to me that as just being so off the wall that someone would think of it this way. But it's a good way to practice and link this particular situation to those terms to really make sure you understand it. So this is going to be your activity, okay? Imagine this situation. In natural situations, this is from Terrell in 1990, down here. In natural situations, kissing leads to sexual arousal. Now imagine that your significant other in high school loved onions. So much so that anytime you encounter onion breath, you become sexually aroused. Your job, and we'll talk about this after we recap the Pavlov information at the next class on Thursday, is to identify all of the following. What is the neutral stimulus? What is the conditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, and the unconditioned stimulus? So that's your activity for the start of next class. And I'm going to actually stop our lecture here because I think that'll be enough to get you going, and then we'll pick up with a few other aspects of classical conditioning and get going into operant conditioning. Again, I apologize for having to miss class today. I'm not one to miss class. I don't like it, but hopefully this kind of gets us up to speed so we don't lose too much time on Thursday.